Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm the Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and the Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of the Center and our co-sponsor, the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security here at Georgetown, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's event, to an extended conversation on a critical topic, Islam, Gender, and Democracy. Thank you all for being here, and Milan, thank you for your co-sponsorship. The Berkeley Center was founded 8 years ago now at the heart of the university as an interdisciplinary research, teaching, and outreach center designed to address how religion intersects with global challenges, including democracy, development, diplomacy, and dialogue. And today we're going to have a chance to explore one such vital intersection, Islam, gender, and democracy, an intersection that has grown more salient, more controversial within Muslim-majority countries, in countries with Muslim minorities, and overall within our global politics and public sphere. I would add that when it comes to religion and gender, Islam has no monopoly on controversy. And in fact, as you'll hear, one of the points of today's session and the larger project within which it's embedded is to place Islam's intersection with gender and democracy in a broader context, religiously and politically. That leads me to my colleagues, Jose Casanova and Jocelyn Cesari, senior fellows in the Berkeley Center and the leaders of a project of which this event, this public event, is a part, a book project dedicated to this issue, and they will tell you a little bit about the wider book project and introduce today's panel. So thanks again for coming, and with that, Jose.
Well, thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure for me to serve as moderator of this session. As Tom mentioned, the occasion for our coming together is the group of us, a group of scholars, around 10 scholars of Islam and gender and democracy. I'm not a scholar of Islam, but I like to sort of on everything a little, are getting together to have discussions about a book on Islam, gender, and democracy. As we know, the issue of gender and democracy in the Arab awakening became a crucial issue. There is a lot of debate within the West. The assumption that you need secularism to basically protect gender equality and women's rights, and democracy without secularism you cannot have. So part of you cannot have democracy, you cannot have gender equality, and so on. So part of the reason for the project, and Jocelyn will explain the project more, is to bring some complexity to these debates, to realize how much more complex historically the relationship between gender, democracy, and religion everywhere, whether Catholicism or other religions has been. And so to put Islam in a comparative perspective with other contexts. So we are going to have 3 speakers. Jocelyn Cesari is going to introduce the project, and we'll have 2 of the participants and 1 discussant. So I'm going to introduce as they speak. They're going to present briefly for 10 minutes, then Milan will respond, and then we'll have an open discussion. Jocelyn Cesari is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, as Tom said, and also a visiting associate professor in the Department of Government here. Is a renowned scholar of Islam and Middle Eastern politics. She also directs the project Islam in the West at Harvard University. Her work focuses on Islam and globalization, Islam and secularism, immigration, and religious pluralism. Her most recent book is The Islamic Awakening, Religion, Democracy in Modernity, which came out this year, Cambridge University Press. She has also written on Islam and Muslims in the West, namely When Islam and Democracy Meet, Muslims in Europe and in the United States. A French political scientist, she has worked before at the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. And she also published in 2013, Why the West Fears Islam, an exploration of Islam in Western liberal democracies. Jocelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to start with a little story. On October 1st, the new general manager of the Turkish State Opera and Ballet issued new rules for employees declaring that I open quotation mark, athletic wear, tight cotton shorts, tight straight jeans, sandals, slippers, spiked high heels, etc. may not be worn on the premises. End of quotation. The new rule made the headline in mainstream media. No more tights for opera and ballet was one of the headlines. And this journalist called Pinar Tremblay wrote a piece called "Why Are Turkey's Conservatives Obsessed with Sex?" And I think it's a very good overture on what the project that we are launching tries to do. I think we have to overcome a lot of simplified ideas that there is a sort of compact opposition of Islam toward women's rights, and that we have to look into today the different national and political context to understand what is at stake when Islamist, feminist state actors are talking about women's rights and Islam. And why is this anecdote of Turkey interesting to me? Because this is what is the most debated topic across Muslim countries. And when Islamists are in power, like in Turkey, like in Tunisia or other parts of the Muslim world, the question is not anymore on the rights of women to vote, on the rights of women to education, or the rights of women in the workplace. This has been overcome slowly, painfully, but I'm talking here about Islamists in the Muslim Brothers sense of the term. I'm not talking about the Salafi. I'm not talking about the Saudi Arabian version of women's rights that are on the periphery of this mainstream of how women's rights are debated. So there are two elements here that have to be taken into account. First, the diversity and the plurality about the content and legitimacy of women's rights across different nations. And it's very problematic when the discussion happens only engaging the Islamic text, while it is very central to look at what is the situation today of women's rights in different contexts. And second, to look, again, not at the Islamic tradition as a compact entity, but look at the way that it has been nationalized and contextualized in different areas. So I would like just to say a few lines on each of these points. First, unlike what is the major consensus, there is no real controversy in the Islamic tradition for women's rights in the domain of work or economy or education. A year ago, the University of Al-Azhar, that is still considered by certain standards as a voice for the traditional position on Islam, issued a Bill of Rights of Women, which is a very interesting document because in the Egyptian context, it meant at the time to push back the Salafi position that is obviously trying to go back to a certain Arabian medieval status of women. And in this context, there were clearly spelled out the rights to work, the right to education, the right to be elected, the domain that remain traditionally described is a woman in family, in the sense that the marriage has to be done in an Islamic context, that the division of role between men and women in the family is not an equal one. And then you have indeed a series of prescriptions regarding Islamic law that create this inequality of gender when it comes to divorce, custody of children, transmission of the name, and the citizenship as well. So this is what is at stake now, in the sense that, again, unlike you are mentioning Afghanistan under the Taliban or ISIS or Saudi Arabia, we are not seeing so much discussion about these rights in economy and politics. If you look even at the Tunisian regime that has been elected Islamist regime after the revolution, you see they have not changed the family code, which remains one of the most progressive when it comes to women's rights. And they can argue from a religious point of view that this is not an issue. Of course, this position that creates inequality in the family is challenged by feminist groups that are not all secular, unlike what we can think, but also that are operating within the framework of the Islamic tradition and trying to promote a more equalitarian vision. And all the elements come and crystallize around the status of the citizen as a moral agent in the public space. What I am allowed to do as a citizen that doesn't contradict the morality of the public space. And it goes with sexuality, it goes with gender, and it goes with the women's body. And interestingly, and that's the discussion we have in this project, it does echo with the same kind of discussion today outside the Muslim world, you know, about contraception, about abortion, about the role of the legitimacy of sexual minority, and so on. So there are here interesting convergences that are not often seen because we think that women are denied all kinds of rights when it comes to Islam. The second point, and I will finish on that, is that again, we have to be very clear that this debate cannot just engage theologians. Theologians can be very sophisticated, and we need them, but most of the questions for the advancements of women's rights are also involving state agents. So any discourse today that tries to debunk the idea that the Islamic tradition is incompatible with women's rights is welcome, but it's not going to advance the reality of women on the ground, because at the end, the framework in which women work and live and are mothers or sisters or employers, this is defined by an existing legal system, and some of these rules are indeed influenced by Islamic prescription. And that's what we have to address here. And unfortunately, most of the time, we tend to push on the side the state role or policies, and we hope in this project to be able to bring together this whole rich tradition of looking at women's rights and the Islamic tradition indeed, and also to look at the whole debate on the democratization and the state changes that also include a greater sensibility of the citizen as an individual. And this is, I think, the major point of contestation today for all Muslim citizens. I mean, there is this idea that your rights, not as an individual, as an economic agent, but the self, what you do, does create limitation on your body. In other words, the limits of rights of the self are limits related to the body. And unlike what we hear in the popular culture in the US today, where you hear, you know, my body belongs to me, or, you know, I do whatever I want with my body, this is something that is highly contested in a lots of space, not only in Muslim countries, but also elsewhere. And that's where the women's rights continue to be very, very problematic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter, Siva Mir Hosseini, is both a prominent legal anthropologist and a prominent activist for women's rights within the Muslim world. We could call her, I guess, a Muslim feminist, right? Yes. And she is professional research associate at the University of London's Center of Islamic and Middle Eastern Law, as well as an associate member of the Center for Iranian Studies. Her work focuses on Islamic law, gender, and development. Among her publications, just fresh from the press, just get it while it's still the ink, Men in Charge, ? Rethinking Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition, and she is one of the co-editors with Mulki Al-Sarmani and Jana Ruminger. published by One World in 2015. So you can get it even before it was published. Then she's also the author of Control and Sexuality, The Revival of Zina Laws in Muslim Contexts, Islam and Democracy in Iran, Marriage and Trial, a study of Islamic family law in Iran and Morocco, as well as Islam and Gender, the religious debate in contemporary Iran. She's also co-editor of Gender and Equality in Muslim Family Law, Justice and Ethics in the Islamic Legal Process, a book from 2013, and she is a founding member of Musaba Global Movement for Equality and Justice in the Muslim Family. Thank you, Mir.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. I want to start by saying that I really think that we are at the threshold of a new phase of dynamics and relations between religion, gender, and state. One important element or aspect of this phase is that things are becoming transparent. And also it is becoming transparent the local and global structures within which Muslim women have to struggle for justice and equality. Their problem is not only local, but it is global as well. And also, it is also making the links between theology and politics transparent. In a way that the struggle for gender equality for Muslim women is as much theological as it is political. And it is difficult, and I find it absolutely impossible to say when theology ends and when politics start. They are very much mashed together, and one element of the new developments, and I call it new because I think things have changed after 1979, and again they changed after 2001, is that these links have become very clear-cut. We have recent events in the region that I come from, Middle East. This is the rise of a rights movement in Iran after the disputed election 2009, then Arab uprising with a lot of hope. And what these recent events really made it clear is the way that women's and gender equality is hostage both to the local and global politics. And neither the local or global, for them, gender equality is a priority. And gender equality can be sacrificed and has been sacrificed for other purposes and for other aims. And also these events, and especially now with the rise of ISIS, the self-declared Islamic State, they are making the links between theology and politics very clear. We could not have ISIS without Wahhabi theology, without the exporting of Wahhabi theology since 1979. And you know, there is a new movement. The kind of Islam that we are talking about actually is very new. You know, that rigidity, that putting aside the entire legal tradition and just arbitrarily to go back to the Quran, take one verse totally out of context and interpret it and justify violence on that basis, it is very new. When we have crises, when there are uprisings, Islamist elements always win the elections. They are mobilized, and also they speak the language that speaks to people, and hiding behind the authority of Islam and Sharia for very authoritarian purposes. What is happening is that what gives them legitimacy, or they draw on the pre-modern interpretations of the Sharia to justify gender inequality, and also to justify their policies. It is basically on, this is what Sharia says. But I want to start by asking that we also need to ask whose Sharia, whose interpretation of Islam, and at the same time we need to ask whose feminism. What kind of feminism? You know, not every kind of type of feminism is actually good for Muslim women. We had imperial feminism as well. And also the feminism that is now coming from inside. So there is actually a reconciliation between faith and feminism for many Muslim women. The whole issue of the religious legitimation of patriarchy has been a subject of debate among Muslims for more than a century now. And basically, if I want to generalize and summarize, is that there are three groups of this conversation among Muslims have been taking place on three lines, or we have three camps. One camp is, I call them traditionalists. Basically, for them, the pre-modern interpretations of the Sharia is divine, not open to change, and they're more conservatives, but they are not political as well. Religion is not a political project for them. The second camp is new. These are the Islamists and political Islam. They have a political project. They go back very selectively to these pre-modern interpretations and want to try them, translate them into policy. So these are also seeing this interpretation not open to any kind of contestation, not seeing them historical. And the second, these are the two. And the second are a large majority of feminists until very recently, which I would call them secularist feminists. Basically, they see religion, and these days, you know, when you talk about religion, immediately comes to people's mind Islam. They see religion as being patriarchal, the source of the problem, therefore it is absolutely futile to engage with it. So any feminist project needs to take place in opposition to religion and not engagement. But there is a new trend that has been emerging, I would say, since the 1990s, which we can call, it's known as Islamic feminism or Muslim feminism. It's very much contested. These are women, Muslim women, who see no contradiction between their faith and their religion, their quest for equality and feminism. And somehow they are bringing religion and feminism together. And we know that feminism and religion don't have a very good relationship. And so it really represents as a challenge for that. And among this group is Musawa, is a group that I have been also involved. And Musawa literally means equality. And we have chosen this name for equality because we want to demand equality and justice within our legal tradition and within our faith tradition as well. And Musawa, I think what is new and unique about Musawa is that it brings activism and scholarship together. And also it provides the activists with the knowledge, with the arguments to argue for rights and equality from within religious framework, and brings Islamic framework and feminism both as a, because for me feminism is not only a movement and a consciousness, it is an epistemological project. It is a knowledge project that enables us to look critically at many disciplines in order, including religious knowledge, and to see how gender and how these assumptions have influenced that. So Musawa basically is doing this, and since 2000, we started 2007, and the movement was launched in 2009, and now we are moving into the new phase. And the book, Men in Charge, which is Rethinking Religious Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition, is one of the projects that we are doing, and I can talk about it later. And I think it is important because it is looking at the way that authority, especially authority of men over women, has been established. And through this project, we are showing that this authority was not given to men by God. It is given to men by themselves. And it has no Quranic basis. It is a juristic concept, and it is built on two juristic concepts, and we show how it emerged, and not only how it emerged, but we contest it from within. So the book has one part of it is dealing with the theology, dealing with the dealing at the same time with the jurisprudence and providing alternative interpretation, redefining it, and also looking at the lived reality. How these two concepts have shaped Muslim men and women's life. And it's the whole notion of male guardianship over women. But to have a meaningful conversation, I think, as I said, we need to start by really thinking that what do we mean by religion? You know, it is an aspect of religion is faith, principles and values. And another aspect is the organized religion. The organized religion is patriarchal, no doubt, but not the faith. And how these two interact is very important. And we are also trying to redefine the relationship between them. And the point is that when we look at the notion of gender equality and equality for women is a totally new concept. It did not exist before 20th century. Therefore, it was not part of the Muslim legal tradition. It was not part of any other legal tradition. Now it has become the part of the legal tradition. And the legal tradition is struggling to meet the challenge that gender equality is presenting. And what is important is that women themselves are now engaging with that tradition. So what we are seeing is democratization of the production of religious knowledge. And I see Muslim feminism as part of that democratization. And movements like Musawa is as part of that democratization of the production of religious knowledge. And given the intimate links between religion and law and society and politics in Muslim context, that democratization is essential to the democratization of Muslim societies. I want to say that we cannot have a democratic process in Muslim context without democratizing the production of religious knowledge, without including women as part of the conversation and as the process of lawmaking. So all this means that we need to ask, who's Islam? Whose definition of Islam, and who's Sharia and feminism? And also demystifying the way that we talk about religion, and especially Sharia and Islam. And I want to say that, you know, when we say Sharia, what do we mean by Sharia? And for Muslim and what we do in Musawa, to make a distinction that exists and is part of the Muslim legal tradition. That is the distinction between Sharia, which literally means the path, and in the Quran it has never been used in the sense of law, and fiqh, F-I-Q-H, which is literally means understanding, and that is the science of Islamic jurisprudence. So Sharia for Muslims is God's will as revealed to the Prophet in the Quran. But any understanding of the Quran is always human. So what we get of the Sharia at the end of the day is always an interpretation. And the problem is that this interpretation until now has been done by men. By the time that the schools of Islamic jurisprudence emerged, which is 150 years after the death of the Prophet, women were totally put aside from the production of religious knowledge. That was not the case. And now that is why I'm saying that we are at the threshold of a new phase, because women are coming back to the production of new religious knowledge and participants in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Professor Yüksel Sezgin, who is an assistant professor of political science at Maxwell School of Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Previously, he taught at the University of Washington, at Harvard Divinity School, and at the City University of New York. but he has also held research positions at Princeton, Columbia, University of Bielefeld in Germany, the American University in Cairo, the University of Delhi, so he has been all over the place. And he's the author of Human Rights Under State-Enforced Religious Families Laws in Israel, Egypt, and India, which was awarded the 2014 Gordon Hirabayashi Human Rights Book Prize by the American Sociological Association, my professional association. And he studied at the University of Ankara, his home country, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, at the University of London, the School of Oriental Studies, of African Studies, and the University of Washington. So, Yüksel, please.
Thank you. I want to start by just referring to a recent survey by Pew Research Center. According to the survey, a majority of Muslims globally want Sharia to be the law of their land in respect to family relations and property relations. According to the same survey, Muslims also want, overwhelmingly, democracy. So, in other words, in plain English, Muslims globally, whoever those Muslims are, they want Sharia and democracy at the same time. Of course, the survey did not ask what people meant by Sharia, what people meant by democracy. But let's assume for a second, when they say democracy, they meant liberal democracy as we understand in the Western society, meaning not only free and fair elections, but also at the same time rule of law, constitutionalism, judicial review, and Bill of Rights that include all basic rights and freedoms that we know in Western societies. So let's start with the assumption. If that is the assumption, is this an oxymoronic demand by Muslims? Can democracy and Sharia coexist? Can we reconcile them? This is an intellectually very challenging invitation for us to critically think about Islam, democracy, and the relationship, the presumed relationship between secularism and democracy. But I believe in the post-Arab Spring environment, this is also highly post-relevant, because the issue here is, as you saw in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, democratically elected governments, they cannot go against the wishes of their people. Basically, we cannot expect a democratically elected Muslim or Arab government to abolish Sharia. So they have to find a way. While maintaining Sharia, they also need to sustain democracy. Is it possible? How can we do that? So this is the main focus of my new project. Let me just, before I tell you about the project, let me just make a couple disclaimers though. As I said, I'm not here to give you a recipe for an Islamic democracy a la Iran, not an Islamic republic. But I'm talking about liberal democracy as we all understand in the Western society. Number two, yes, Sharia. I started with Sharia referring to this Pew survey. I would avoid using the term Sharia. I will reserve Sharia for classical Islamic law. For me, as I often argue in my research, we talk about Muslim family law. I will not look at or I will not include in my discussion of Islamic law any criminal or penal law. By default, crucifixion, amputation, stoning to death are fundamentally undemocratic. I will not even include or take that into consideration in my discussion. But I'm exclusively referring to Muslim family law, MFL, for abbreviation purposes. I don't want to say Sharia. Because after all, there is not one single monolithic, globally accepted understanding of Sharia. Sharia is multivocal. Not across the globe there are different understandings, but also within the same society you have different interpretations of Sharia. So it's better to avoid that concept at all, altogether. One, perhaps another disclaimer about secularism, especially as we talk in the American context, the wall of separation. It's a mythical understanding that only exists in our imagination, the wall of separation. There is no such thing as real entire separation between state and religion. I often tell my students, if you ask a lady whether she is pregnant or not, the answer that you will get is a binary answer. She will say either yes or no. There is no half pregnancy. At least she will not say I'm half pregnant. So when I ask them about different countries in my comparative politics classes, whether Denmark is secular, whether Norway is secular, the answer is not yes or no. It's all a matter of degree of separation or entanglement between state and religion or church. So from that point of view, if you look at different countries from Germany to UK, from UK to Norway, Norway to Ireland, Ireland to Switzerland, every country, all Western liberal democracies, have found different ways to devise that very institutional relationship between state and church in their own ways. That means there are multiple forms of secularism and it's possible. So, having said this, what my main argument is, I think it may be possible to reconcile Muslim family laws within a liberal democratic framework. How so? In the last 10 years or so, I spent a lot of time in different countries, Muslim majority, Muslim minority countries, sitting in Sharia courts, talking to Sharia court qadis, judges, as well as, especially in my last book, I also did extensive research in rabbinical courts and Hindu law in India. So I have this comparative perspective. I don't want to essentialize Islam. The issues that I'm talking about, you can just take it as an issue, a global observation about religion in particular. So we talk about here etatization or state appropriation of religion. So during this research, I talked to hundreds of human rights activists, Muslim feminists, Jewish feminists, Hindu feminists, judges, lawyers, scholars, etc. As a result of these exchanges, I came up with a 10-point schema, if you like. Since we are in Washington, D.C., I want to be policy relevant. I came up with 10-point schema that make reconciliation of Islam with Muslim family laws with liberal democracy possible. I'm not going to go through all 10 points, but I'll just share with you 4 of them, which I consider to be the core of my argument. Number 1, a liberal democratic regime, a Muslim government, democratically elected Muslim government, has to recognize freedom of religion and should not subject people forcibly to the purview of religious law, which means a couple of things. Number 1, apart from Muslim family law, they should also have a secular code for people who do not want to consent to religious law. Have a secular alternative for people who do not want to live by religious law. And let others who want to be subject to religious law with their own free will be subject to that religious law. The law and the Constitution has to also recognize the right to convert out of Islam. So once a person, a Muslim, converts out of Islam, that person should not be penalized. In some jurisdictions, for instance, the moment of apostasy or conversion out of Islam, the marriage is automatically dissolved. So that should not be the case. An apostate or person who converts out of Islam is also disqualified from inheritance. That should not be the case. So no penalty for freedom of religion. Number 2, the rulings of religious courts or civil courts which apply Muslim family laws should be subject to review by constitutional courts. So basically, they should have a constitution which will include basic rights and freedoms, and all of the rulings of religious courts and civil courts which apply Islamic laws or Muslim family laws should be subject to constitutional oversight. Number 3, the state has to regulate 3 very important, or at least as I consider them to be very important, activities. Number 1, the polygyny or polygamy. Number 2, talaq, or Muslim husband's unilateral extrajudicial right to divorce. And lastly, underage marriages. So as I said in my research, there should not be any marriages under age of 16. The law should set it at age of 18, but there may be some exceptions to the age of 16. The religious law, Muslim family law, should recognize any underage marriage as void and invalid. Lastly, this point is very important. The state has to allow, protect, and empower cultural dissenters. What it means? It means this. Basically, if state courts enforces and interprets Muslim family laws, the state has to allow a certain political space to cultural communities who offer alternative interpretation of those religious laws. That way, at least from revolution or change from within change from within will be possible within the Islamic legal system. In relation to the last point, as I said, during my research for the last book that I published last year in 2013, I spent 27 months in Israel, Egypt, and India, mostly doing observations in Sharia courts, rabbinical courts, and Indian state courts, where judges deal with the issues of Muslim or Hindu law, etc. I saw, at least I humbly learned a couple things from my research in those three countries. Unfortunately, top-down secular interventions into religious law, whatever that law may be, Muslim, Jewish, or Hindu, top-down secular interventions into religious laws often backfire, or most often, they fail to produce any tangible improvements in the human conditions. Especially this is true for the case of women's rights. However, reform from within, led by what I call hermeneutic communities, seems to be more effective and promising in the long term. These so-called hermeneutic communities are human rights organizations, women's rights activists. I'm just sitting next to one. These are very well versed in international law. They go to meetings in Manhattan, in Geneva, Beijing, Vienna. They know CEDAW, UN Declaration of Human Rights. So they're very well versed in international law and women's rights standards and discourses. When they come back to their native communities, what they do, they graft those values, global values, upon their own tradition by reinterpreting the text and the narratives as what Musawa is doing, or what Muslim women living under Muslim laws is doing, what sisters in Islam in Malaysia is doing. So it's a global phenomenon going on, a silent revolution led by these organizations. I observed this from Morocco to Indonesia, from Indonesia to Israel. So what most interestingly, what I saw in the context of Israel and India, these women's organizations in particular, they transcend religious, ethnic, and national boundaries. I saw Jewish Orthodox women coming together with Muslim women, working together to pass legislation within the Israeli Knesset that will improve the Muslim women's rights to maintenance. At the same time, I saw Orthodox men and Muslim conservative men within Israeli Knesset, Israeli parliament, coming together to block that legislation. So I think this is what, as I said, there is a silent revolution led by these hermeneutic communities. Yes, the problem with that, perhaps, we may not like the pace and the level of reform carried out by these organizations. Some may consider this to be insufficient or too slow. But in the long term, there's a higher chance that they will be accepted by their native communities. So I'm not making an argument here for cultural relativism. I strongly believe in universal rights and liberties, but I believe that every society should be led to their own pace to adopt by their own means all those international principles, particularly in regard to matters of family life and women's rights. So I want to stop here for time limitations, so I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. And now, to respond and discuss these presentations, we are fortunate to have with us Ambassador Melanne Verveer, who is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. Most recently, she served as the first US Ambassador for Global Women's Issue. In this position, she coordinated foreign policy and activities relating to the political, economic, and social advancement of women, traveling to nearly 60 countries, a lot of miles accumulated. She worked to ensure that women's participation and rights are fully integrated into US foreign policy, and she played a leadership role in the Obama administration's development of the US National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Before, from 2000 to 2008, she was the chair and co-CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership, an international NGO that she co-founded to invest in emerging women leaders. During the Clinton administration, she served as assistant to the president and chief of staff to First Lady Hillary Clinton. She's one of our own, as the Jesuits would say. She received a BS and MS from Georgetown University. Ambassador Verveer, Welcome.
May I say that she will leave at 6:30?
Yes.
I just have to leave a little earlier.
We'll continue, yes.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to finally participate in a program of the Berkeley Center, which does so much extraordinary work. And I want to say at the outset, this discussion is a discussion with enormous implications and consequences for our world. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a scholar in Islam. But I have spent the better part of 2 decades working with women all over the globe, but increasingly with women in the predominantly Muslim world. And much of the way our world will go forward will be dependent on what's happening. Now, Yüksel said that there's a silent revolution taking place. I'm not sure it's so silent anymore. I think it's much more that we're seeing a paradigm shift, and hopefully it will be a shift that will lead us to a better consequence, not just for the people being immediately impacted, but because of what it will represent for the greater world. Women everywhere are on the front lines of change for dignity, for economic opportunity, for human rights, for the kinds of things that we all want to see. And Ziba mentioned the efforts in Iran, very difficult place in the various terrains that we're discussing here, after the last contested election. And I remember so vividly, the face of that revolution was Nada. And this was a young woman who was killed out on the streets with so many others. And that face was beamed around the world. And in many ways, it was a wake-up call for much of the world of how active and how committed women are to the kind of change that they want to see. Fast forward to the Arab awakening, where women stood shoulder to shoulder with the men without violence, certainly initially, from Tahrir Square to Tunisia, across Libya, Yemen, etc. To the point where I was having many meetings as a government official in that part of the world. And I remember vividly in one of the regional meetings in Tunisia, one of the men in the audience said to me, "Do you all realize how the role of women has changed and what the Arab awakening has represented in terms of our perception in our own places, in terms of what that means for us, but also for all of you?" Several years ago, the Arab intellectuals, under the auspices of UNDP, did a study called the Arab Development Report. And what that report showed was that those countries that are hugging the bottom, that are the least developed in human development terms, that are not making the kind of progress every nation, I think, wants to see itself make, are those where women are kept behind, where they are least educated, where they are not participating economically to the degree they can and in the ways they can, and they are certainly not politically empowered. And what the report said is until that changes, until women have that opportunity to fulfill their God-given potential, you're not going to see the kinds of changes that these countries want to see in the development that's important. And so in the process, you see this yearning on the part of so many women, with the good men who have joined this struggle with them, forging ahead. Even in a place like Yemen, which is so incredibly difficult and tradition-bound. Tawakkol Karman was one of the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize a couple years ago. And she was telling me how the women who had always been inside their homes, who were completely covered, went out onto the square. And there was tremendous pushback because they were told they didn't belong there. And she said to me, the women have awakened, even in Yemen, and they are not about to go back to sleep. So I agree with the fact that something is happening here, and I don't think it is so silent. I think it is extremely consequential. And one of the reasons for this progress is what's been said here, and that is the fact that so many women, as they've said to me, say, I am tired, I am frustrated, I am depressed, that my religion, which I hold dear, which means everything to me, the values that I espouse, are being hijacked by others, whether they are of the extremist sort or male patriarchal interpretations, from keeping me from being what I believe I can be, which is an empowered, faithful Islamic woman. And so what they have done, as Ziba so eloquently described, is move to a place not where they are rejecting their religion, but where they are recasting all those interpretations that have, by male leaders who have interpreted what is right for them, in ways where they're saying, that's not what I espouse, it's not true to our roots, it's not true to what we see as our religious identity. They're not compromising their religious identity. And I think this is a very important point. And I think it's one of the reasons that this is so revolutionary, because it makes it that much more effective. Now, much of where I come from is from the experiences of the lives that women live every day in these circumstances. Some, as was said at the outset, are in those extreme worlds of Wahhabism and Salafism and radical extremism that ISIS represents in its worst brutality, all of it targeted on women. But even in places like Tunisia and other more mainstream, moderate places, the struggle goes on there in different ways. And I've seen this manifested from the most grassroots, if you will, from the bottom, from illiterate women to the very top, the kind of expertise you see on this panel. And I'll just tell you 3 quick stories about how this is being demonstrated. One is in Pakistan. I'm sure some of you may have read a few years ago about a young woman in a village in a rural part of Pakistan who was gang raped. And she was gang raped as a punishment to her for what her brother supposedly did, holding hands with a young woman in an adjoining village. Whatever the facts were, what happened to her was unspeakable. And it was fully intended that because of the dishonor that she now brought to her family because of what they did to her, she would kill herself. And that would be the appropriate result of what had happened. Well, she didn't do that. And I asked her, I said, Muhtar, how did you live with what had happened to you? And she said, my mother believed in me, and I believed in a different kind of God. And in her own way, she was interpreting what her religious values meant in terms of her own life. She took her case to court, which was unheard of, and eventually she won very small damages, and she used them to start schools, one for girls in which she enrolled herself, and one for boys. And I said, why did you do that? I mean, when you think a poor, illiterate woman, what she could have done with that money. She said, because nothing will change without education. And then I looked at Sakina Yakubi, who is somebody the Berkeley Center knows very well. She was recently honored here. She's a very intelligent woman, and she was trying to get girls back to school in Afghanistan and dealing with all of the Taliban kind of accretions of horrors that are perpetrated in the name of Islam, the kind of Islam nobody recognizes except them. And she knew that these schools would never happen, or at least be safe, unless she rooted that experience in the religious values of the communities. And so she went from mosque to mosque, and she said to the imam, I want to build a school here. And she said many of the times the imam said to her, there is no role for girls' education in our religion. And she said she would get out her tattered Quran, and she had it all highlighted and underlined, and she would read. And to this day, those are the schools that haven't been attacked, they haven't been burned, because they are in a protective zone, if you will, one in which the religious values are dominant in the provision of that education to the girls. The third is a very significant case in terms of real change that has happened through a campaign and effort, and that's what happened to family law in Morocco, which is probably the most difficult place to bring about change. Child custody, divorce, polygamy, all the kinds of issues that are caught up in a lot of these interpretations. And I know many women who were imprisoned, some who died in prison, fighting for family law in Morocco. And what they realized, they were carrying on a campaign for this reform. They were getting nowhere because the backlash came from the clerics who said, this is not in concert with our religion. And they told me they were very offended because they considered themselves practiced in their faith, committed to their faith, and their faith was being used against them. And what happened in that case is they basically took back their religion. They wrapped the campaign in religious values. They had 1 million people all across Morocco sign a petition. And the new king at the time, the young king, basically put a commission in place in the end that included women significantly. It included secular legislators. It included clerics. But it was a very representative group of people to really look at this issue. And it was the women who played the dominant role in that process. What happened was family law reform was achieved in Morocco because of the king and because of the women. And when that law was proclaimed, and I found this to be brilliant, the king promulgated it and took the provisions of the family law reform. For example, women have the right to custody of their children. It was followed by a verse from the Quran. Deeply put into what were the predominant values of the society and believed to be such, not something that was just for show or for political persuasion. Now, the hard work is the implementation. There is pushback. Judges have to be trained. People have to be made aware of their rights, et cetera. But this is the kind of thing that is happening. And Moroccan women, and Morocco, many Moroccans, probably the great majority, are extremely proud of what they've been able to achieve and in many ways are a model for others. And what I have found repeatedly from women in these countries is the plea, don't come to us with your Western ways of doing things because they won't fly. We won't make any progress. And in fact, there was a conference recently, took place in Qatar, where some women from the less progressive countries, if I want to call them that, were hoping desperately that they would get some skills as to how they can make their arguments rooted in their religious values. And instead, they said to me, it wasn't helpful at all because several, as Ziba called them, let's say secular feminists came convinced, as rightly they should be, in the rights of women rhetoric, and these women found it absolutely unhelpful because they said those arguments would never work in our country. But there are arguments that do work, that are very much who they are, represent who they are, and have receptivity among the large numbers of people and basically take the religion back. So this can't be imposed from the outside. And it has to be done, I think, the way it is being done, where women are on the front lines of change. They are actively engaged in some of the most unlikely places, and they are using their faith, reclaiming their faith in ways that allow them to be what they believe they should be, leaders, not victims, agents of change in their societies.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We now have still half an hour before Ambassador Verbier has to leave, and then we can continue for another 15 minutes for an open conversation. There will be, I think, some phones going, some microphones, yes. Please identify yourself, be brief and to the point, and basically, you can address your comments, your question to any of the speakers or in general. So please, here we have.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Fariba Parsa. I'm assistant research professor at George Mason University. I'm originally also from Iran. My question first is just a definition of secularism, because it's so confusing. And I'm thinking, if we take a secular, as it is in U.S., secularism in U.S. Didn't hurt any religiosity. In fact, many Muslims have more freedom, religious freedom in U.S. compared to their own country. So it's a separation doesn't mean less religiosity. Second, in Iran, you talk about Iran or other countries, it's like 100% of Iranians are Muslim. We have so many other religious minorities. We have Baha'i, Jew, atheist, or some other, I would call them Muslim on a paper, not in their heart. We have Zarathustra. There are so many other religious minorities that, yeah, they don't, they respect Islam as a religion, but not as a part of the government or the state. So I would like to hear your comments. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is not a debate on secularism. We will have to, I mean, I can claim some knowledge on it, but I'm not even going to try to answer this question. I can only say with an anecdote. There is this famous anecdote in Northern Ireland, Protestant and Catholic moving from one area to another and being asked, are you a Protestant or a Catholic? No, I'm an atheist, but which one? So it's like with secular, I'm a secular, but which one? So there are as many forms of secularism. So the idea that secularism is what comes after religion, of course, we know that this is not the case, it's very complex. But what is clear is that everywhere in the world today, secularism is being put into question, is being debated. So unlike what 20 years ago, we thought we knew what secularism was, today is everywhere debated.
But I do think that her point about the United States being viewed by, well, certainly we have the separation of church and state, if you will, so however one wants to interpret that. But it is, in terms of all the data that we've got, one of the most vibrant religious societies in the world, largely because whether you're a Muslim or you're a Christian or whatever, you can practice your faith openly, except, you know, we're always going to have pushback for somebody in some quarters, but that is how we conduct ourselves.
And the other country, of course, is India, which also is a secular country, right? But where secularism and its critics 20 years ago, the whole debate on secularism began in India before it began in the West, and yet one of the most religious countries also, right? So.
I think it's also agree with Rosaline, that is, there are so different regarding the context. If you ask Iranians, I think majority don't want Sharia, they want democracy. So it's different from Tunisia or Egypt. So it's, they want to be, they are Muslim, majority are Muslim, but I don't believe they want a religious Islamic state.
Can I say something on this? Because I feel that the question is mostly addressed to what I was raising. The question or what I'm talking about is not the divide between, I don't see any tension, there is tension, but it's not, the main site of struggle is not between secularism and Islam or secularism and religion and human rights. It is between despotism, authoritarian, which always can go hand in hand with patriarchy, and egalitarianism, pluralism, and democracy. So this is the main site of struggle. And in Iran, the case of Iran is interesting. After 34 years of a so-called Islamic Republic, which basically is imposing one interpretation of religion, and also it's not democratic, okay? But the Iranian Revolution was a different matter. What has happened is that Iranian society, Iranian political culture, not the state, has become secularized in a sense that a large majority of Iranians, both some of them at the political elite, among the clerics and ordinary people, have come to the understanding that in order to be religious, in order to practice their religion, the state must be separate from the institution of religion. That is a totally different matter than separation of religion from politics. I think you cannot separate them because both of them always intertwine. But this process of secularization of society and coming to that understanding happens through experience. And this is happening. And Islamic Revolution in Iran happened in 1979. It wasn't from the very beginning for this type of regime. It was a revolution that different parts of the society came together, different trends, but it took another direction. And the direction that it took, that is where the role of external forces is important. Because 1979 was important. What happened in 1979 was we see the zenith of political Islam with the Iranian Revolution. Also, we see the passing of CEDAW, or adoption of CEDAW, the Convention Against All Forms of Elimination, which puts women's issue, women's equality at the mandate as an international mandate, and women's rights as human rights emerges there. So what we see basically is really two frames of references, two ways of looking at things clash. But by 1990s, we see movement on both directions. And also 1979 is important because it is when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And the rise of Mujahideen, this extremist form of Islam, came after that. Who paid for that? Who created them? CIA, as part of the Cold War. So we must not forget these conditions. And then the rise of Wahhabi, or export of Wahhabi ideology by Saudi Arabia, started after that. So developments took place. There were huge contestation in 1980s between the so-called political Islam and the so-called women's rights activists. But by 1990s, we get a kind of resolution. And this resolution comes in form of Islamic feminism. That is what things are happening and changing on the ground. So do not take me wrong that I'm not arguing for a religious state. But one point that I'm making, and I insist on that, for any feminist project, for any sustainable change to be meaningful, it must go through people. And religion is a very important element of that. And especially in Muslim context, it also has a political side of it. Therefore, it is time to open these discussions. And I also think that we really need to ask now, what does it mean to be religious now? What does it mean to be secular now? You know, these are now being really redefined. And you can be secular, but not democratic. That is what happened to the previous regime in Iran. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the revolution. You can be religious, but totally, also you can be democratic. So we really need to go beyond those boundaries.
I would like just to say a few things here, to go back to what is secularism. I think the term is too connoted and loaded by the Western history. And we have to distinguish, in the work I do, I try to distinguish between the institutional level and the social level. Institutionally, the US is the only one in the world, even you cannot compare with France, that is really applying a separation of state and religion. In Europe, there is no separation most of the time. So would we say that European countries from Belgium to the Netherlands or Germany are not secular? So there is here other criterion than the separation to take into account. And this is very key because indeed when we make separation the key, we exclude discussion in Muslim countries where people would not be, the question is not the separation. The question is one, equality of all religion before the law. And this is beyond Muslim women. It's indeed, and you're absolutely right, what is the status of every individual from all religious groups? And we are completely blinded by this kind of homogenization between a certain trend of Islam, in Iran, Shia Islam, with nationalism. And what about the diversity of the country? So this is a question to address. It's not to say, get rid of Islam. It's say, what are you doing with all your religious group or individual before the law? And the second element, and that's where I think there is also a key here, is that what are the individual rights independently of religious limitation? And these are two elements that make the difference, let's say, between Belgium and Iran. These are the two things that cannot be really assessed. And women's rights are part of it, but it's a broader democratization process that we have to take into account.
Let's move on to the next question. There was a second there, and there's a third here. So we have a microphone here, the third.
Hi, Elif Andat-Jones. I'm a brand new adjunct professor of sociology here at Georgetown. Thank you for a fantastic and engaging talk. And I love that all the speakers talked about the connection between patriarchy and the patriarchal culture and what that does to women's rights and equality, and 100% agree. The problem for me that I'm struggling a lot, even in the most democratic countries in the world, like the United States, where patriarchal forces have official institutional power, they can wheel back the forces of democracy and equality and the rights, and then women who have fought for a long time for their rights can suddenly find themselves, oh my God, wait a second, what's happening to my body, what's happening to my rights? On the one hand, I also agree that the reform movements within the Islamic world have to come from bottom up. There is no other way. But on the other hand, when you combine that with the lack of democratic tradition, institutions that would protect the rights and efforts of the people out on the streets, and very well entangled interests of the deep conservative segments of the society, religious, non-religious, but definitely patriarchal, holding the power and not wanting to go, I want to be optimistic, but having trouble. So if we cannot feel confident that, oh yeah, nothing is going to happen to women's rights and we're never going to take a step back in the United States, how far do you think is going to take these movements in newly democratizing parts of the world? And that might be a question related to the secularism question or not. Like I'm going to leave it up to you. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, if I can start.
Yes, please.
The struggle for women's rights is an ongoing struggle. I mean, it was 20 years ago that Hillary Clinton said in Beijing, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. Somehow that was viewed as a very radical statement, as simple as that proposition was. And that merely meant that women's rights weren't something separate from human rights. Women are human. But the connotations were such that I remember shortly after she said them, she was on a Voice of America radio program, and there was a caller from the Middle East, and he said, "Mrs. Clinton, what did you mean when you said women's rights are human rights?" And she merely said, "Well, sir, why don't you close your eyes and think about all the rights that men have? Well, women should be guaranteed the same." Now, we know that the reality is it's not the case. And you're exactly right about the United States. Eternal vigilance is what is called for because often it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so this is a constant struggle that goes on. But I'd rather be optimistic than pessimistic. I think far more women are educated today. The numbers of women, even in places like Saudi Arabia, their access to economic power, to critical thinking opportunities, there is change as much as there is a lot of pushback. But I think what it says to all of us is we have to keep at it. You know, I think about what happened in Tunisia not all that long ago, where the struggle that was being discussed here earlier was playing out in terms of whether or not, as Tunisia was adopting a constitution, women's equality would be chiseled in that constitution. And there was a big struggle between forces of Ennahda and what they represented in terms of a much more go backwards perspective, and those who were always in that place. And what happened in the end was very instructive. There was a move in the Constituent Assembly to change equality to complementarity on religious grounds. And what you saw within 24 hours were millions of people on the street saying no. And they were able to retain that. Now, how that plays out in the future, what its worth is, whether or not there will be the guarantee of equality, that is going to remain to be seen for the very reasons you expressed. What are the institutions going to be like? Are they going to be there to protect that provision of rights in the Constitution? Or are the interpretation going to be such that it's going to push it back? So I think this is a constant struggle, but I would rather see, because I believe it to be the case, that progress is the direction we're moving in, as tough as it is.
Please. I think this is a very good question. The bottom-up approach, I think, as I also argue in my research, is that it should be used as an interim strategy. Because at least in my research, it's not only about Islamic law, but also in the context of Jewish law, Hindu law, etc. There are certain limitations that you have to understand. And medicine is only good if you know the side effects. So this is the same thing. If you want to rely upon what I call hermeneutic communities, if you want to encourage change from within, you also have to understand that there may be some inherent inequalities in the text, in the tradition, that you cannot just simply wash them away by hermeneutic activity. You have to recognize that. Number two, the interpretive activity has to challenge existing gender relations and power relations. So it's very important that, you know, once you try to find cultural references by reinterpreting the narrative and the scripture, you have to make sure that it's really making certain power holders uncomfortable, so it creates new set of rights. That's another very important point that we have to keep in mind. Number three, I guess, one of the main problems that I observed during my research with the bottom-up approach, you know, just reinterpreting and relying upon the religious text and the tradition, it may inadvertently create this notion that people should live their lives by religion alone. So every time when you talk about human rights, the only source should not be religious texts. So what I'm suggesting is that it should be just one of the potent tools that is available to human rights and women's rights defenders across the Muslim world, and especially countries where religious law is enforced by the state. I think, which means that it should be employed as part of a multi-pronged strategy where you still continue to impose or force nation states to sign CEDAW, remove the reservations to CEDAW. So you still use top-down, at the same time bottom, so you find a happy medium, at least to make sure that women's rights and human rights in general are respected.
Thank you.
Yes, I choose to be optimistic. Because, you know, if I'm not optimistic, I can't do anything. I agree with you. It is really difficult to be optimistic. But I think, like faith, hope is something that you choose. And once you choose it, it actually gives you power as well, and also enables things to happen. Change is happening. Change is happening, actually. And engagement with religion and what Muslim women is doing is part of that change. It's part of a wider struggle that's going there. And the structures, democratic structures, are more and less non-existent. So it is actually women are fighting in a very difficult terrain. But at the same time, what they are doing, changing things. They are chipping away the authority of the authoritarian interpretations and actually creating a new authority. And this process of self-authorization is extraordinarily important. They are self-authorizing themselves to read the text, to claim their faith, and also to claim the public space. And it's amazing, you know, the courage that women have. It's extraordinary. So I side with Hope.
Very good. This was third, and then the fourth, and then the fifth there. No, wait a minute, no, the third person is there. You are the fifth.
Thank you. Sabira Qureshi. I'm an independent consultant working on gender issues. My question is for Ms. Hussaini. You talked about reform from within, and of course it's tremendous the work of Masawa and all the other groups that are working along this path. I just wanted to ask, there are certain aspects where you can start to talk about reinterpreting. And then there are certain parts of the divine word which are very difficult to move away from. It's there in black and white. How do you reinterpret something which is there in black and white? And I'm just wondering, do you think it's at all possible, whether now or sometime later in the future, that one can move away from the divine texts and try and incorporate what you call the reinterpretation, the reform, in a way that permits this kind of move? I don't know if my question is clear, but there are certain verses in the Quran that feminists and Muslim feminists have struggled with, but it just has not happened. Does one put aside those texts? Or do you still try to reinterpret and reinterpret and reinterpret them?
No, it's not reinterpretation. And actually, this is what you are asked is the topic of this book, the research project that we have been working for 5 years. And the first product is out. You know, there are over 6,000 verses in the Quran. Out of these 6,000 verses, only 4, one can interpret it or take it as being un-egalitarian. And the most important one is verse 34, Surah An-Nisa, chapter on women. And basically, this verse is the whole edifice of family law is built on that single verse. But the main question that we need to ask is that why, out of these 6,000 verses, Surah An-Nisa, the chapter on women, starts with the verse which basically confirms the cosmological, ontological, and essential equality between men and women. Okay? And there is no gender there. Why, out of all these 6,000 verses, this verse has become the source of family law? Why? Why jurists chose them? Why they didn't put the emphasis on other verses? Because this verse does not talk about marriage. Marriage, the way that the Quran defines it or talks about it, is totally different from the juristic conception of marriage. So it's not a question of reinterpretation. It's a question of understanding how religious knowledge was produced, how these conceptions of rights and gender came. These are not divine. These are human constructions. And therefore, the project, the new trend in reform thinking, no longer goes back to the Quran to find the origins of democracy and gender equality and human rights, because these are new concepts. And it basically looks at what the Quran is bringing to Muslims. The Quran is not a book of law. It's a book of guidance. And also the Islamic jurisprudence is emerging. So it is moving totally in a different direction. But as part of it is hermeneutics, is the interpretation, and also the new approaches to the Quran. But the main problem that we have is that the absence and the lack of democratic structures for the new interpretation to be heard by people. Look, all Muslim reformers had to leave their own country. Abu Zayd, what happens to him? Abdul Karim Surush. You know, this is the absence. It's a vicious circle. It's not the problem is not with the text. The problem is with the context. It has always been with the context. And, you know, but there is a relationship between text and the context. So that is why I have a lot of hope in the new Reform thought, which is totally different from the previous generation of Reform thought. And there is a mass of literature. And what is exciting is women also participating in that. So I think, you know, to answer your questions, we need a whole day. But it is possible. It is possible. And of course, the fact is that what the Quran did, we need to go back to the Reform. What the Prophet did was to take people from the injustice of their time to the justice of their time, not to an eternal notion of justice. And the whole idea of equality, the way that we think about it, gender equality was not part of the justice of the time. And the Quranic reforms were really directed at protecting women, slaves, and the orphans. And not only protecting them, but empowering them, and showing the path and trajectory towards justice. And now, in our time, in our context, there can be no justice without equality. But let us not forget, until 100 years ago, you could have justice without equality. But the definition of justice has changed. Therefore, our understanding of the text has to change.
No, and just, I think it's obvious to all of us, but I'll say it anyway, this is not unique to Islam. Yes. We've got the same problems in terms of scriptural interpretation, whether it's by Christian churches or Judaism, etc. Many of these battles, different connotations, but our adjunct professor alluded to the situation in the United States. Many of the arguments made against certain supports and protections for women are made on very fundamentalist interpretations, without form criticism, without literary criticism entering in to those discussions. So this is not unique. Obviously, it's playing out in a significant way in our world today, but it is not unique to one faith group.
Let's not forget this is a Jesuit university, and our Jesuit Pope is opening the gates of Ijtihad in Rome, in the family synod. Thank you, Ambassador Verveer. So we have, thank you. The microphone we have, okay, you have the microphone right there, so please, and then there. The next one here. No, please.
I've enjoyed many aspects of the talk, particularly what you were saying, Professor, about the importance of changing our attitude towards reform and pinning the problem on feudalism and on autocracy. There are two aspects of what I've heard that have disturbed me deeply. One is I find the whole concept of a 10-point plan intellectually offensive, if I may say so, because, and especially the way you described the manner in which you proceeded with your research. I'm from India. For whatever reasons, I've had the ability to engage deeply, or at least just have deep discussions about feminist struggles in India, academics in the US talking about feminist struggles in India, and I've had the opportunity to be a woman in this country with the skin that I have. And I find there are two problems that come out with these kinds of sort of very, what I find flippant attitudes towards interventions that can be made in countries that struggle with deeply entrenched issues of caste, religion, feudalism, sectarianism. And second, one thing that bothers me as a daughter of a feminist father is where is the talk about men as partners in feminism? So many times when I walk through anywhere in the US, I find that if I'm walking alone, I get the benefit of an exceptionalism. I'm the victim of everyone. I'm the greatest victim in the world. I'm the victim of my own men. I'm the victim of white men. I'm a great victim. And so people are friendly. I can be holding a knife in my hand and people will assume I grabbed it from an abuser, or it doesn't matter. I get the benefit of that. I walk in the same space with a man of color, and suddenly he becomes everyone's enemy. And my father has taught me more about feminism than my mother. Patriarchy is not something that is simply unleashed upon women by men. And one thing I find that this kind of discourse does is it creates greater divides that, if I may take the liberty to say, is very much supportive of the demonization of Islamic men, which is supportive of another agenda altogether. And while that may or may not have its own strategic purpose as a woman who walks around in the world, I find myself a victim of this kind of feminist discourse. And as with the 10-point plan, I feel that I was in India when many of the outbreaks, the outbreaks occurred that related to the rape of the woman. You may or may not have heard of it. There was huge outcry because a woman was gang raped on a public bus. And what happened was that from before that very moment, before this became a public, symbolic moment of victimization, there were many people, men and women, working together to change policies, to change structures, to create police systems that would be more sort of helpful to women and to really change society from the bottom up. The moment this became a global international issue and you had 10-point plans coming in, the flippant attitude with which people were happy to engage with the issue across the globe ended up really being something that prevented the bottom-up change. So I think we really need to start, and I appreciate what you're saying about new approaches and new generations. We really need to think about ways in which we can correct the way we think about these issues, approach these issues, and talk about these issues that don't re-victimize people.
Can I say something? I completely agree with that. The problem with feminism, and it starts in the West and it's sometimes duplicated outside the West, is to think that you have to empower women while the whole vision should be a holistic vision. What is the relationship between men and women? And you are right that it goes with the demonization of men that in some Muslim societies is very, very dangerous because it goes to, confrontation that should not be there to start with. And there are sort of a priori that are put on men vis-à-vis women that are not completely reflecting the kind of interaction happening on the ground. But then the question is, who is in charge of this holistic vision? It cannot be just the women actors only. There is here, again, I have an obsession with the state. I was told that you need a sort of framework to make this happen. And what I see, unfortunately, is that in the name of religion, but you are right, in the name of patriarchy as well, and class, a term that didn't come up yet, but it's an important one because the status of Malala in a region is not the status of a Pakistani woman in the capital. So we have to be very clear here what we are talking about. So you need a framework that works for the common good. And unfortunately, no state today in the Muslim world has worked for the common good. And that's, I think, a big issue. It's not the religion, it's not the patriarchy only. It's what kind of political community has been built using Islam, patriarchy, culture, and so on.
Michel, would you like to?
Yes, I'm very sorry, but I don't quite understand the objection to the 10-point because I really don't think that I was trying to victimize, because as I tried to explain, I tried to as humbly put these 10 points as a concise plan for policy makers, because after all, there are disciplinary issues that in the sense that I'm a political scientist, and when I talk to the policy makers and the ministers, people who sit and write the constitutions, right? Nowadays, in the last several years, around the globe, a lot of people, mostly men and women, sitting together and writing constitutions. So basically what they need certain framework within which they can make sure that women's rights, men's rights are protected, but at the same time, deliver people. Through observant people also have access to their own faith to entertain, enjoy their own belief in their own way without state intervention. So basically, this is what I was trying to summarize, that I'm using as a framework to understand, particularly, this is not necessarily for India or Hindu law, but particularly Islamic framework. But I'll be happy to talk about that after the talk.
Hello, I'm Kauthar. I'm from Tunisia. I'm here for a professional fellowship funded by the Department of State. In Tunisia, I'm going to talk briefly about what I'm living in Tunisia. I work with women and rural women. I'm going through enhancement economically because it's going to lead to the gender equality. And what is happening in Tunisia since the revolution is that the most popular party, which is Nahda, unfortunately, I wasn't here to hear what you talk about concerning Tunisia. But what is happening is nothing really is changing beside what's happening in the constitution and other, but it's a lack of control of the people, which is bothering the others. I mean, I'm gonna give you an example. When I see children at the same age as my daughter, which is 4 years old, put in veil and go into Islamic kindergarten, for me, it's a kind of discrimination. And we are losing right with a lack of control from the Islamic Party. We used to have secular freedom. We gained all this just after the independence, the right to vote, the right for abortion, and other things. And since that, I feel like we are losing some of our rights, and indirectly. So I'm trying to be optimistic about the future, but not separating the religion and the law, and it's a kind of, it's complicating the things, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to?
If I may just say a few words. What you are describing is what we are also trying to address in this project, which means, indeed, you are right. After independence, most of the states granted to women rights in the economic domain, education domain, political domain, and Tunisia, like Turkey and others, were at the forefront of this advancement. The only thing that was still defined by Islamic law was the family law. And we have heard that this has changed across decades. There have been improvements. Again, Tunisia was on the most progressive side, but we mentioned the Mudawana and the recent change in Morocco. So this is evolving. But we should not consider the secular state as a complete progressive, equalitarian state vis-à-vis women. Even in Tunisia, it was not the case. So what the Islamists are doing, and stop me if I'm wrong, but they have not questioned the code. What they are doing is exactly what you are describing, which is Islamicizing the social relation that used to be much more secular. So this is this tension again in what is in the law, what is the practice of people, and what is the empty space where indeed a moral discourse can happen. And you're absolutely right. Women are usually the target of this moralization. How they dress, where do they go, how they interact with the other gender in the public space. And this is a trend you find everywhere. But I'm not sure it means that women are going to lose, to go back to the question, you know, are we going back? I'm not sure that women are going to lose in Tunisia the right to go to school, for example. Maybe I'm optimistic more than you would. But, you know, this is the kind of thing where the contestation and competition are happening. Yeah.
If I may briefly just add something, I think that the really, really important positive story of Tunisia is that in a country in which an Islamist party had a majority and could have tried to use this majority to impose its vision in its constitution, decided to be a self-limited power and bring others to have a constitution that was written by consensus. So this is really, really the best positive if we are able to develop this kind of because ultimately democracy is not only a majority rule, it has to be the respect for minority rights. And this is what the Tunisia process has shown. Now, the Islamists themselves, in their own private life, in their own civil society, can basically develop their own moral, but as long as they don't bring these moral issues to the constitution and force others to follow this law. So I think ultimately the Tunisian story is a fantastically positive story in this respect.
Yes, can I say something on that? You know, the question, the point that you are raising, you know, when there is a clash between liberal values and democratic process. Because the fact is, whether we like it or not, once the space is open, people vote for al-Nasha. People vote for Muslim brotherhoods. That is, they have done. But the question is that why they vote for them. Why? Because before asking this question, you know, we can't really answer that. They vote for them because of the absence of the political space during the time of the previous regime in Tunisia and there. So once the political space opens, the groups that are organized are Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Nesha. And what really also, they speak the language of people. The way that they relate, their values are very much in line with the values and morality of the masses as well. And also the secular forces should ask themselves why they haven't been able to reach that. And the beneficiaries of the previous regime in Tunisia, yes, it was very progressive, but what percentage of society it reached? Elite women at the top. Once the right is given, it can be taken back. And I think what is happening, I'm also agree with you that the Tunisian case is important because there is a kind of democratic accommodation which is happening at the top. And that is helpful. Then it depends on you, groups like you, how to be able to reach those women who have been already reached by groups like Al-Nesha. So contestation opens.
In the past by the former president and the former regime. And since the Nahda is talking as they are religious, but they will protect freedom and the right to be religious or not, etc. But I can assure you that most of those who voted Al-Nahda are disappointed now. Because it was
what democracy is.
That is what democracy is, yes.
The disappointment with all the coverage. With this, I think that we've come to an end. You had the last word. And I would like to thank the panelists. Thank you all. Thank you.